Yet both de Beauvoir and Irigaray in the end, remain ambivalent about women's mysticism. De Beauvoir addresses the power of the mystic in a brief chapter which is situated in that section of Le Deuxième Sexe that discovers different strategies of women seeking to ameliorate their individual status, but ultimately failing to change the dire situation of women in general, which according to de Beauvoir can only be changed through collective strategy. So the mystic as an individual strategy. As Hollywood puts it, and I quote, de Beauvoir recognizes that mystical experience historically granted some extraordinary women limited forms of authority. Yet for de Beauvoir, mysticism merely serves as a justification for women's political oppression within male-dominant society. And also revisiting her earlier work, Mary Daly argues in her post-Christian introduction that adopting de Beauvoir's model of transcendence within theology is not enough. And I quote, "Women must learn to set their pride not merely beyond, but also within sexual differentiation." Also, Irigaray is not satisfied with the transcendence that she attributes to female mystics, and in the end, their relative autonomy, she argues, fails to challenge the patriarchal hierarchy of the church. Feminist perspectives on saints and on mystics. Now, going back to Martha. Martha's attachment to the saints might be read in terms of the attraction of transcending the body, of transcending sexual difference, exercised on many women within Chiel. Such a reading should, I believe, connect the theological significance of Giussani's "I am not my body" to a social logic or a sociology of how sexual difference is shaped within a patriarchal context. And this reading might indeed enable us to understand how particular forms of agency are engendered while others are foreclosed in the context of female piety. But what I want to suggest, however, is that such a reading remains bound by the same limits, by some of the limits of the return to agency, which I mentioned at the outset of this talk, and its insistence on demonstrating the agency of pious women. Such demonstrations easily tend to consider theological language and a reference to the divine as a strategic expression of pious women's own agency, and thus somehow pitting own interest or own agency, and thus affirming the integrity of a subject of her own, pitting that against the relationship to the divine. Now, this insistence of women's agency on women's agency then begs the question how to take seriously the agency of a subject when she is committed to ascribing her own agency to God. And this is a formulation of Hollywood, a dilemma, Amy Hollywood notes, which still remains unresolved. Within the social sciences, Saba Mahmoud's work elaborates this point most insightfully. In Politics of Piety, Mahmoud argues that women's agency, as conventionally understood within classical liberal terms as the realization of one's own interests against the weight of customs, tradition, or transcendental will, that this own agency this notion of agency is informed by a number of assumptions and elisions, and most notably that it is informed by a notion of resistance, which is ascribed to the concept of agency and even taken to be its paradigmatic sign, resistance to patriarchal structures and so forth. Mahmoud offers a reconceptualization of agency as the capacity for action enabled and created, sometimes paradoxically, by historically specific relations of subordination rather than in opposition to them. And this is, of course, a Foucauldian understanding of how the subject works. Now, how can we then understand, in sociological terms, agency as the capacity for action in a context in which the relationship to the divine becomes incarnated in ethical and corporeal practices? I pose this question, of course, against the background of how the conceptualization of the social as an autonomous object of knowledge in the last couple of centuries was premised on positioning religion and the religious as a constitutive other of the social. Now, to begin addressing this question, I looked at those instances in my respondents' narratives where established understandings of agency begin to unravel. In the time that remains, I will zoom in on one dimension of agency, and that is the understanding of the concept of choice, the capacity to choose as being central to established sociological understandings of agency. For instance, notably, look at Anthony Giddens' definition of agency, where choice becomes important. And once more, I will return to Marta. A careful analysis of the transcripts of our interview reveals a subtle but undeniable tension between my use of a vocabulary of choice, me as the interviewer speaking about intentions, preferences, or choices, and her systematic reframing or shifting of my questions. This becomes most clear, and the example I'm going to give here is not an example of a subtle, it's not subtle here. This becomes really unsubtle and clear when I inquired about where she positions herself in relation to the two life forms that she had described, the family or the memoris domini. And in her response, Marta steers away from an understanding of choice. I think I actually asked the question as what will you choose? Very unsubtle. And relies on an understanding of vocation instead. Her problem with the notion of choice in this context became even more explicit when we were talking in another part of the interview about work-life balance. And I quote her here. Yesterday, I was speaking to a colleague of mine who said that the family is a vocation, just like work is, and that one has to choose, either family or work. This horrified me, as if I can choose family as a vocation. Already here, the sentence doesn't work. I choose as a vocation. End of quote. So vocation, Marta suggests, belongs to a different register, a different dimension than choice. One does not choose vocations. One might be able to hear a vocation, to receive it, to discover it, to understand it, either slowly or in a split second, either willingly or unwillingly, but one does not choose it. In other words, while Marta remains invested in her capacity to act, and notably to act upon a vocation and what would be the right way of acting, she understands this capacity to be shaped in concert with the realm of the divine, with another actor involved in this vocation. Moreover, when Marta spoke about the two possible forms that life can take, she insisted that both, despite their differences, were about the same thing. They were about establishing community. The precise expression she used was the following, so I quote, "For you, choice means company. Whether it is a man, a woman, or Christ himself, you do not remain alone." End of quote. Now, Marta emphasized the term choice as if it were in quotation marks. So this is part of the verbal dynamics that came in the interview. Like, for you, choice means company. Here, choice was about a relationship, a deep engagement, which is also the context in which this choosing came about. Choice, in other words, is not only a poor way of talking about vocation for Marta, it also badly conveys the community context in which her capacity to act comes about. And instead, the notion of choice suggests a more individual genesis of these actions. And finally, it is important to note that the capacity to act to which Marta refers is not only relational, so both in relation to the divine and in relation to the community, but has implications on the level of embodiment. The notion of vocation, for instance, requires a particular understanding of the body and the senses. One needs to be able to hear or to see or to feel in particular ways in order to relate to a vocation. The body and the senses need to be wired in a particular way, one could say. Ways that are not necessarily, or not at all probably, recognized as secular. And this underscores the point that established understandings of agency within social sciences rely on what Charles Hirschkind, in a recent essay, has called the secular body. And this highlights the point that particular concepts of agency each come with their own understandings of the body. And this also begs the question, what is the naturalized understanding of the body that underlies these concepts, and kind of a naturalized understanding of the secular body? And by way of conclusion, and to now actually speak a bit to my disciplinary community, which is sociology, in the light of established understandings of agency, which within social sciences use notions of choice, free choice, acting independently, pursuing one's own interest, pursuing one's free will. So in the light of these established notions of agency, the capacity to act, here narrated and represented by Marta, is doomed to found lacking of choice, of free will, and so forth. In a sense, what my project aims to do is to shift this qualification of lack away from the empirical subjects that I have been talking to and working with, to the established sociological frames that position subjects like Marta. If we are dealing with a shortfall here, then it is, I would like to suggest, a lack of sociological imagination. Back in the 1950s, C. Wright Mills defined sociological imagination as the vivid awareness of the relationship between experience and wider society, and suggested that it involves the ability to understand how personal experience, the experience of the I, emerges and is situated at a crossroads of all kinds of structuring social relations. Such an understanding of what sociology is and what it does, I believe, leaves ample space to take seriously the experience of a subject who experiences her I not as a bounded individual who makes free choices on her own, but understands her capacity to act as emerging within constitutive relationships, including a relationship to the divine. Marta, who was the pivotal figure in my talk today, could be considered as an eccentric, maybe as an ecstatic subject. A subject that moves out, moves out of a liberal secular understanding of the self, a subject who is constituted by a set of relations, including a relation to the divine, and who consistently remembers, and here the figure of the memoris domini come to mind, who remembers that her capacity to act emerges within and is shaped by those relationships. In this sense, there are, of course, many kinds of ecstatic subjectivities, many of them not necessarily religious, and I would also say many religious subjectivities are not necessarily ecstatic, but subjectivities who in different ways stand in tension with ontologies of both identity and individualism, and with other premises of many of the established sociological tools to account for social reality. And the question I want to end this talk with, I will not provide the answer, I will just provide the question, and to read more about the answer, you should probably wait till the book comes out. The question is, what would a sociology of ecstatic subjects look like, and how would it transform sociology as we know it?